Now, great pleasure to introduce Charmian Larke, who's going to be speaking what zero carbon means for Cornwall. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to see so many people here. When we started on this trek, I thought we might get 30 or 40 people. I kept saying, it'll be fine, not everybody will come, but it looks like everyone has, which is brilliant. So I apologise for some of the crowding, and I hope we can work well with the seminar stuff later on. So it's about zero carbon for Cornwall, but obviously in the context of local action. So we've heard from Stefan how dire the situation is, and from Amanda about how everything relates to everything else. But is it not on?
It needs to be better located. Yes, I've got one.
Can you hear me now? Is that better? No.
Can you come to the front of the desk?
No, I need to see the slides. This is my speaking. What you get is my speaking
Voice
notes.
goes up behind the screen, I think.
Can we turn one of these around?
I think it was where the mic was located. That's better.
Probably smothered by your scarf.
I can't take that off.
You're amongst friends, Charmian.
Can you hear me now? Is that better? By talking to my chin. I had to do a talk once when it was all old men, and I had to talk with a very low voice because they couldn't hear the high tones. So hopefully you can hear me now. Right. Climate change emissions are mostly carbon dioxide and methane, and it's largely from energy. So here's one of my pie charts. 75% of our global emissions are from energy supply and use, and then 25% are from land use. This is in broad terms. Obviously there's detail in there which I'm avoiding talking about because of lack of time. So that means if we deal with the energy supply and use, we've dealt with 3/4 of the problem in terms of continuing emissions into the atmosphere. We know from Stefan we're way over where we need to be for safety, but that isn't what I can talk about so much today. So it's largely an energy issue. And for those that don't know energy, which is most folk, energy is the unseen centre of gravity of every single thing we do. If you try and imagine anything in the way of an object or an activity that you do that doesn't require energy, I'd really like to know about it because I don't think there is anything. Even getting a packet of lettuce seeds and growing them in your own ground requires the packet to come from somewhere else, and that requires energy for the packaging, for the transport. Every pair of jeans, every new appliance, every time you buy a new phone, that's all energy going into the materials and obviously the transport and the use of these things. So to get to zero carbon Cornwall, we've got to cut our energy demand drastically, change all energy demand to renewables because it's fossil fuels which are causing the problems, reduce our consumption of material goods because energy is required for all the goods and services that we use, and that isn't the bit that's talked about very much. Cut our emissions for agriculture and land use, and we've seen a dramatic satellite photograph from Amanda of the soil washing out to sea. That soil only washes out to sea with the rain because we treat our soils badly. We mine them instead of restoring them. So that's one thing we have to do. And also, we've heard from Stefan, we have to cut the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So that means collecting it in a novel idea of a tree or the soil. Masses and masses of CO2 can go, or carbon can go into the soil if we enhance soil life. But mostly I'm going to talk about energy. So when we come to the local level, which is where we're talking about today, energy demands locally is managed mainly at the local level. That's where energy is used, where we all are. So we are all guilty, in that sense. I'm putting apostrophes around it. We're all busy using energy at various levels of activity. Some of us are doing it more than others. Those that fly out to India or New Zealand or wherever obviously doing huge amounts of extra carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So it's an individual issue as well as a collective national and local issue. But energy supply, which for Cornwall is mostly coming from upcountry, is a land use and development issue, and hence the importance of doing the neighbourhood plans. So getting to zero carbon means changing both energy demand, because we have to reduce the amount. If we want to reduce the amount of renewables we need to install, then we have to reduce the demand, because it's a two-way thing. And as I've already said, 25% emissions is down to land use. So with INDPs, I am now going to give you background assumptions. Now, some of these are my assumptions, and they won't be the same as other people's. I freely admit my biases. But some of these are factual. So local energy supply is a factual bit. The local energy supply improves energy security, because you've got it local, you've got it under your own control, hopefully. Local social cohesion is important in getting there to installing local renewables, and of course if you've got them locally owned, then you've got more activity, financial and economic activity within your area, so it improves local health, local wealth, does improve local health as well. And obviously if you've got more local economic activity, then that improves the well-being of the local society. And of course it gives you long-term quality jobs, because some of this stuff's quite difficult to do and requires high-tech skills. Now, coming to the assumptions, which are my personal ones, which you may or may not agree with. I don't think we can rely on others to provide for us anymore. I did some work in Myla, I've been doing some work in Myla, and one of the responses to a thing we had on the website about climate change and the need for local action was, I think central government should do this. Now, I disagree, because I don't trust politicians. I don't trust the way central government is going, and I think we have to take more power locally. But that's my personal bias, and I know other people won't necessarily agree with me. Hope those who are here today will, because obviously you want to have local action. So I think it's important that we stand as adults and we do stuff for ourselves. Climate change will see devastation locally and elsewhere unless we act now. We've seen that from previous speakers, and I think we know it in our hearts as well. And there are other world issues which will impact us fast. Now again, this is my personal view, but there's lots of other people that share this. So there's massive financial problems worldwide, and lots of economic and financial gurus saying we're heading for another financial crash. We've seen the beginnings of nature, well, large devastation from nature. We know that is really nature in some areas is almost the last legs. We've got rapidly increasing energy costs of energy. Now that's a bit technical, but it basically means we're scraping the barrel on fossil fuels, and it takes an increasing proportion of the energy embodied in the energy you're trying to get that energy. That means there's less energy left to run society. And if you get too low, society collapses, because there's no money for anything, because it's all gone in getting the energy. And resource depletion. So minerals in particular are going into very low levels of resource. So for example, uranium's down at 0.02% in the ore. So anyone who thinks that nuclear will solve the problems, they don't understand reduction in resource depletion. So the economic thing on uranium is at 0.022, but they're actually at 0.02 for the concentration. So it's huge amounts of energy to extract the minerals, and it gets harder and harder to do. So the actions required to get to zero carbon in your plan, your local plan, there's 5 there, but obviously there's a lot more than that. But when we're thinking about energy terms, find out present energy use and emissions, and there are a lot of government statistics out there. It's quite hard to find your way around, but you can do it. So first of all, you find out the energy use, and then you allocate with various the CO2 to those energy use things. And it changes from year to year, because, well, over the last few years we've had a lot of renewables installed, so it's reduced the carbon intensity of electricity in this country. Now, I propose that the next thing to do is work out what's needed in your patch to meet IPCC targets. So it's halve emissions by 2030, and it happens that 2030 is the time frame for the neighbourhood development plans. So it actually fits quite neatly together and saying, we have to do this. The key authority on the planet says we need to do this. One of the key things, the IPCC report of October 18, which Amanda's mentioned, although Stefan didn't, because he doesn't want to think about non-science things, because he's a scientist, and that's what he does, is that, I lost my plot. So what it says in that is that we have to 2030. Now, it said 12 years, but actually, of course, it's 2019 now, not 2018, so that's less than 12 years. And every day it's getting a shorter and shorter time. Now, they say from emissions from 2010 to be halved by 2030. So that means if our emissions have gone up between 2010 and now, and the latest data you can get is 2017, so everything is very uncertain in terms of the numbers. So all we have to do is take as best we can do and work from that. Nothing is certain except physics, as Stefan said. So we take the best we can do and we go from there. So we know we have to go in a downward direction in terms of CO2 emissions. So then it's down to each group whether they decide what they decide for the reaching zero. There's different time frames have been suggested by different people. 2030 by some, 2040 by others, 2050 by others. And I think one of the key things here is that you have to get started on the process. Once we have a process in place and more people are joining it, it's easier to speed up. But it's very hard, and you're at the beginnings of this now, it's very hard to get started. But so many people here, it's brilliant, it means you can do it. So once you've got your targets, say, right, we've got to produce X amount of carbon reduction by Y time, then you work out what you can do in terms of your local supply potential. And well, I'll go into a bit of detail on that. And then next step, develop appropriate policies to achieve that and set up action groups to follow it. Now those all don't necessarily go in those order because people might decide to do them in different order. So here's an example, and I apologise for tables. I love tables, but I know not everybody does. Not everyone manages numbers. This is an example Carrot Parish I did a year ago in North Cornwall. Do not worry about the actual numbers. The key things to notice here are 44% of the energy in this very rural parish goes in buildings and 56% is transport. 70% of the energy is oil. They don't have any gas in this particular area, and lots of bits of Cornwall don't have gas. So their carbon emissions are largely down to oil. That's oil for heating, oil for transport. Now, I know that's hard in NDP terms to say, okay, we're going to get rid of oil, because it means change your transport system. But what you can do, as part of changing the transport system, is set up the renewable energy supply for the transport system. So we need everybody to change to electric vehicles, or even push bikes, or electric bikes, or walking even. But of course there's lots of different issues around there, but those are the key things in terms of keeping your energy down, improve your buildings, cut your demand, change your heating, change to electric vehicles. So in round numbers, this particular parish had an energy demand of 20,000 megawatt hours a year. If you turn everything, this is ideal of course, change your heating from oil or gas to heat pumps, for example, then you cut the demand hugely because you're using energy from the environment, which you're concentrating a bit like a fridge, only the opposite way around, to move the heat from outside into your house. With using some electricity, but only a third of the amount of energy required compared to originally. For example, wood stays the same, and then we're changing electricity, making electricity the same. The key change here, in terms of amount of energy, is if you change to electric vehicles, you cut your energy by a third, because fossil fuel vehicles are really, really inefficient, whereas electric vehicles are a lot more efficient. And of course, you can get your electricity locally. So you're halving your overall demand for energy before you've done anything about cutting the demand within each individual sector, like housing, by improving insulation or whatever. So the key thing to remember there is we're doing a good thing by changing to electricity, right, and get it from renewables, because you can get half the amount of energy. So it's not such a big task as people think it is. So that's our example parish, with 5,000 tonnes a year CO2, 71% oil, 20% electricity. So their 2030 target under the IPCC idea is 2,500 tonnes. And that gives you then how to progress to your next stage. So if you look at your local energy supply potential, the main potential supplies in Cornwall are wind, solar, electricity and heat, biomass, and there's small potentials in biogas and hydro. But this is a very overall look, so we just focus on wind, solar and biomass. And biomass obviously is plants, wood in particular, and Cornwall only has 7 or 8% wood forestry cover, and some parts of Europe have 20% or more. So it's worth thinking in your plan about how you would integrate more woodland, best for nature, good for local supplies of all sorts as well. So doing wind, I like wind energy, and most people do. So you do surveys to find out what areas you've got which are away from dwellings. And the key driver there is siting wind turbines so that you don't have noise nuisance. So the larger turbines obviously have to be further away from houses than smaller ones. And a key thing to be aware of is the fact that our present central government does not like wind turbines. They had a letter from 100 MPs, including the local MP here, a few years ago when David Cameron was in charge, saying, we don't like wind turbines, please stop them. So they did. So that means if you want to have wind, which is a really big resource, and it's the only one really available in the winter, is you have to put in your NDP, you need to put specific sites or areas, because otherwise they can't get planning. That was how the government put a stop to onshore wind. That's not to say that we can't get on in the future and do offshore wind, and there is somebody working locally and a big area for offshore wind off Cornwall, but that's not relevant to the NDPs. Your job is obviously to pay attention to your own patch and what you can do within your own patch for your own energy supplies. So that means put wind, assuming you all like wind, or enough of you like wind and recognise it's a good resource to use, you need to put them in your own patch, in your own plans. If people are worried about that, that's one of the questions to ask in the community, particularly to encourage it to be community owned, because then something like 70, 80, 90% of people say, yes, let's do it, if they can see some immediate local benefit. And nationally, wind's very popular, 76% support, only 5% oppose. And when they did the last survey, they couldn't find anybody under 30 to say no to wind. All the people that oppose it are really geriatric. Well, not entirely, but lots of them are. So here's an example of a couple of maps, the same location in my secret North Cornwall location. Some of you might recognise some of the names. So this is what it looks like if you're mapping. On the left-hand side, we've got 500 kilowatt size machine. So that's mapping away from the houses so you don't have noise nuisance. It's not the best way to do it, but it's relatively easy to do. And the white areas you can see potentially suitable for wind turbines. And then obviously you have to go through lots more constraints to see what's sensible and what's not. And then the right-hand one is suitable for 2 megawatt turbines, so you've got to go further away to not have noise nuisance. Also, that means you don't have visual dominance generally. Now, those of you who know what a map looks like can see that some of those areas are actually going down into the bottom of the valley. So you wouldn't want to put your wind turbine at the bottom of the valley. A couple of years ago, somebody went for a wind turbine at Wheel Jane, right close to the bottom of the valley, and everybody just thought, crazy, because when it was up, it was right in the face of the people who lived at the top of the hill, so that one got turned down. Wasn't the best location in terms of the wind, but it was the land that was available. So when you're looking at it from your local point of view, you start with getting away from houses, and then you go on to say, what are the other reasons why we might not want something here? So that gives you a starting point. And on the map you can see there's a settlement on the right-hand one. It's more easy words, Bombay, but near the woods there's an ancient settlement. So you might say, no, this isn't suitable because we don't want to upset our local archaeology, our local feel about our history. So that might be an area that will be wiped out for that reason. But you should find that in the end you do have some areas which are suitable. So you have the technical potential, you do assessment of the other issues, and then you work out the potential for wind supply for your area. So another map, another table. Now this shows basically how much more energy you can get out of bigger wind turbines. So if you wanted to produce the energy, if you took the far right column, if you wanted to produce for your electric future for our parish, using 50 kilowatt machines, you need 46 of them on low height hubs. But if you wanted to do it with a 2 megawatt machines, you'd only need 1. That's because the taller machines are up in higher wind, and obviously they got longer blades, they capture more of the wind energy. And it's dramatic, the change. So although people worry about things piercing the sky and the sky will fall in, actually you only have to do it a few times with larger machines. But you might, if you want to achieve the same electricity output, you've got to do it with many, many more small machines. So that's one of the issues to think about when you're thinking about how you might use wind energy. So solar energy, PV, photovoltaics will fit on local rooftops. But all the areas I've done so far, that only gives you a very small percentage of your local electricity demand. But it is useful for individual buildings. Don't estimate the power of people having their own energy source. They become much more aware. Shift the load to the daytime, so run the washing machine in the daytime, things like that, rather than at night. And that is really useful for increasing awareness and increasing action by the local population. And it can involve a lot of people. But if you're serious about getting into estimating local renewables, then you need to go onto the land area stuff. So land arrays for volume production. I'm sure everyone's seen them around the county. Fields of blue. So for this, it's actually, you can more or less put them anywhere you choose, but it obviously has to get through planning and it has to be acceptable in the local area. So you take an example output, you multiply by the area, and then you can make decisions on what kind of visibility is acceptable behind hedges or peering out from your tree tunnels, or maybe it's got to be at the top of the hill rather than the side of the hill so it's not visible from other places. And the land arrays can be anything from 50 kilowatts up to a megawatt or more, i.e. 1,000 kilowatts. So it, again, is up to yourselves when you're thinking about this, is to say, well, okay, what sort of scale fits in with our landscape and our field pattern? And I think we need a lot more better understanding of how to make these kinds of things fit into the landscape, particularly edges. Now, one of the things that people worry about with solar arrays is that they sterilise the land. But that doesn't have to be the case. You can still get good agricultural value. Two pretty pictures, one showing sheep. And sheep individually, particularly in windy locations, they will heft to particular panels and they get shelter from the wind there and shelter from the rain. And some places, there's a solar farmer I know about who's actually saying, well, the grass is going better around the solar array because it gets shelter from the wind. So the grass grows better. Although there's some, obviously there's solar shading, but they get more grass out. So the sheep are happier and they're getting 2 crops. You can also use them for biodiversity, increase wildlife and so on. And because you've got security fencing around, you can use them for free-range hens, geese and so on, because they can't escape and the fox can't get them. And having had a few hens got by the fox, I know what that feels like. So biomass potential, I've already mentioned the importance of having woodland, and we don't have enough in Cornwall. The council a few years ago had 3 trees, it was wonderful, we put 1 million out I think. So we had some on some of our hedgerows. So estimate extra areas for wood fuel, and I think you also need to be thinking, if we're thinking seriously about sustainability, then we need to be looking at wood for construction, so timber houses, timber buildings, making furniture locally, all those kinds of things. And the right kind of woodland gives you biodiversity. I do not suggest conifer plantations anywhere because they're not really very good for the soil. That if we have mixed coppice woodland, then you get very good improvements in the local, the ground, the soil and soil life and the plant life. And it's worth looking at how you link up woodland with wildlife. Wildlife corridors in particular are important to think about. And it's a useful link between thinking about local energy as a resource and biodiversity. As Man has already said, everything is connected to everything else. So together, you look at what your supply potential is, you assess against the targets, and then you develop your land use ideas around those targets and your potential. And then the next step, obviously, is to develop the policies to help achieve that. And one of the key things maybe is to not stand in the way of those things happening and try and set up things which are moving it in the right direction. And I really urge everybody to get their local groups to follow up and keep the process moving, because it's all about the process. So just a couple of minutes on Cornwall, because I like to go and think at the Cornwall level. It's the same process, but the numbers and complications are larger. So energy supply, energy use in Cornwall in 2016, 48% oil. And we have 11 gigawatt hours a year, no, 11,000 gigawatt hours. So it's 11,400, no it's not, it's 11,400,000 megawatt hours. So it times up by 1,000 if you want to get that down to the household level. Kilowatt and megawatt hours, 1,000 kilowatt hours. So energy demand is more or less 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 domestic, non-domestic and transport sectors. So when you know that information, it makes it clearer what you need to do to get to zero carbon. And obviously it has to come from the emissions. So oil is 48% of the emissions. And I've mentioned before that we don't have a lot of the gas grid here. And one of the key things about being in a hole is you stop digging. So we should not be extending the gas grid anymore in Cornwall, because that stops people going for renewables in their homes or businesses. So we stop digging. We do not build any more roads, we do not build any more airports or anything else which uses energy in a large amount of fossil fuels. That's the first thing, stop digging. Second thing is working on where to cut your emissions. So the direct energy emissions in Cornwall are around 3 million tonnes of carbon. 3 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's including the methane and the other gases. But it's lower than it could be because our electricity supply is now 30% renewables. So in the last 10 years, it's come a long way. And one of the things I worked out for fun, because I love numbers, is that we've got quite a lot of domestic solar panels, PV. And I worked out that people in Cornwall, individual households, spent round about 400 million over 7 years investing in their own energy supply, i.e. putting PV on their roof. So remember that 400 million from the domestic sector, just because it was there available as a thing to do, people could get a 7 or 10% return, which is not as massive as the venture capitalists require, but it's a good steady return, and it got people thinking about their energy use. Now the indirect emissions, which are much harder to deal with, are consumer goods, tourism, 20% of our emissions, agriculture and food, and developing buildings and infrastructure. In total, that comes to around 16 million tonnes. So energy, the direct energy use, is relatively small. And the key thing for us as individuals to be aware of is 36% of the indirect emissions is down to stuff. I go on about stuff quite a lot. So it's important to cut down all your new things. Stop buying a new phone every year, get one every 3 years, or don't have a smartphone even. Stop getting a new kitchen every 3 years. Stop getting new carpets. Go for craft things which are made locally, even repair stuff. That's a novel idea. And I know it's hard to do, but repair stuff, we need to increase repair cafes, improve the skills of repairing, and get into, it's cool to keep things for a long time. Like my shoes are about 25 years old, I think. Still halfway reasonable. So that's one of the things we can all individually do. I know it's not really something that an NDP can think about, but we can think about getting the facilities in place for repair, for craft and so on, so we can enable, as and when it becomes the cool thing to do, to get everybody repairing and making their own. So those are the general things we need to do. If we're looking at Cornwall as a whole for energy, so we changed the demand to all electric vehicles. I say that as if it was simple. No, I know it's not. I'm just giving headlines here. And all fossil fuel heating to heat pumps or local biomass. Now that's very generic. There might be lots of different examples in different places. Now to do that, if we want the local energy supply, requires 350 turbines, wind turbines, and 1,800 hectares of PV arrays. Or 1 or 2 turbines or 8 to 10 hectares of PV per parish. So it depends on how people want to approach it, what's involved. Now, 350 large wind turbines seems like, oh, scary. But it's doable. It's doable. In medieval times, 20% of the land area was for transport fuels, i.e. fed horses. So it seems reasonable to think about 20% of our land area maybe for our energy supply, but actually we can do lots of other things as well with it. So I mentioned earlier that when you multiply up to the Cornwall level, it does get more complex, because you have to think about the grid, smart grid, demand control, getting access to the grid for all these supply systems. We need to make it work. We need lots of energy storage, batteries, pump storage, and lots of other ideas which are coming along. Planning processes need changing. We need to get all planning inspectors trained in climate change and what it means, so that they will say yes to good things and no to bad things. And that's my next target, is planning inspectors.
Good luck.
Now, one of the things that people worry about is, how are you going to fund it? Well, I've already mentioned that over 7 years or so, we have £400 million invested by the domestic sector, by households, individual households, in renewables. Now, if we take I think it's about 4 billion over, say, 20 years to do this. That's including the grid stuff, the installation, and the plant installations. That's not counting planting trees. I haven't counted that bit. That works out £1,000 per household per year, roughly. So I would suggest that we need to think about things like having a pension fund where people pay in, individual households pay in £1,000 a year, and then after 10, 20 years they can start to get back the income from those investments. And that will be long-term, steady income, which is what pension funds like. And if we do that on a Cornwall level, it's big enough to be of interest to how for structuring finance point of view. One of the other issues to be resolved is attitudes in society. I'm suggesting very daring 350 new wind turbines in Cornwall. And I know there are anti-wind people out there saying, destroy the landscape. Actually, I think we're now at the point where the landscape's going to get destroyed by climate change. So we have to decide what's important. Do we want to survive as a society, or are we going to worry about a change in the view and puncturing the sky? I would hazard that the sky was already destroyed at some level, isn't it? So, but it requires everybody to be saying that and to be aware of it. And then, of course, all this kit has to go on land, which in our society is privately owned, generally. So part of the task here is to talk to local landowners and get them involved with what we want to do. And it's urgent. So the time available is really important. So we need to get there. We need to be focused, which hopefully people are doing. And I was really chuffed when Amanda asked the question, how many people have talked about climate change recently? Nearly everyone had their hand up. Wonderful. We've got to get on with that. We've got to aim for zero carbon, in line with the IPCC report. Now that just stops us from the worst of climate change. It doesn't stop it, it just makes it less bad. We need to integrate energy and environmental policies and not think that nature is separate from our use of energy, because it's not. It's the energy requirement brought about by capitalism and growth, the growth mantra, which I won't go into. Go on. No, we haven't got enough time for that. I just stick to energy and environment because, as has already been said, they're all interlinked. So if we start working on sustainability, we get to clean energy, and that leads us into an improved environment. And we must not accept people saying, no, you can't do this. I've talked with planners recently and other people, and they've all been saying, the system says you can't do that. And I said, where does it say that? And there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the system says, because there was an act which came in 2015, the Deregulation Act, which says, no, you're not allowed to go zero carbon, or worse that effect, in legalese. But that element of the act has not been brought into force. Everybody thinks it has been, but it hasn't been. So there isn't anything that stops you, other than the attitudes of planning inspectors, which is why they're our next target, stopping us doing zero carbon. And obviously it's really important to include the local community, get everybody involved as much as possible. So I end with Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Thank you. So we've got a few minutes. Amanda as well.
Okay, thank you. So we will try and kick off the afternoon session back on time at 2 o'clock, which is slightly shorter period for lunch, but time for a few questions now, if that's all right. Waiting. Yes, some questions about it. Yes, it's up. Make sure I get the gender right away.
This question coming from a place of completely supporting what you're trying to do and with I've never heard people say they will pierce the sky.
Can you speak up, Zoe?
Yeah, I've never heard people say that windmills may pierce the sky, but I have heard quite realistic critiques, not only because of sound, but also strobing affecting people, and also where the minerals come from to actually build them. So these are kind of really practical things that it would be really good to have some info on when you are going to push this. So I don't know if you want to say, or you have some resources on the detail.
Wind turbines can cause shadow flicker, they call it. So if you happen to be in the wrong location, too close to a wind turbine, with a window, because it doesn't really happen outside, it only happens inside. And the people who are developing a wind turbine or wind farm have got software. I've got it in my office where you can work out where and when any shadow flicker might happen. So part of the design of a site is making sure that you don't have that.
Charmian, I was just going to add, I'm Dan Stone from the CSE, and we've recently republished a peer-reviewed document about common concerns about wind turbines, which sets out all the science, objectively good and bad things as well. So have a look at that.
Could you repeat that? Because we can't hear what they're saying. Could you just repeat what he said for us?
Should I stand up again? Yeah, so I'm Dan
Speak
Stone.
louder, Dan.
I'm Dan Stone from the Centre for Sustainable Energy, and we've just republished a document which is entitled Common Concerns About Wind Turbines, basically, and it's peer-reviewed, objective information about all the kind of issues about wind turbines, basically, including some of the issues raised there.
The Centre for Sustainable Energy Guide on Wind.
And we'll make that available. We'll circulate a link to that to everybody who's attended the course, the conference.
With the slides, yes.
How long will all slides, hopefully?
Yes, a summary of the slides or all of them. Let's see. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Matt Laney, I'm a chartered surveyor. Just Charmian, the 4 things you suggested on the energy profile of what we need to do, I'd like to add 2 more, which would be, first of all, let's super insulate our homes,
Oh,
super
absolutely.
insulate our
Yeah.
buildings. We don't need the energy supply that you might need.
Yeah.
We need to pack that in. And I'd like to just comment on ground source heat pumps and geothermal energy.
Why do you not mention ground source?
I said heat pumps. That includes air source and ground source.
So if
I was trying to be quick.
United Downs, where they're drilling one and possibly only of these beautiful geothermal energy things, they've got a lot of embodied energy, and it has its cost. But they're producing 100 degrees centigrade already at 2,250 metres, at nearly 3,000 metres. Their target temperature is 180 degrees at 4,000 metres. Now, for each one of those, it probably costs £15 million to do. But that's enough for 3 megawatts of energy, which would drive 2,000 homes. So we might want to just add to the mix that you've suggested, just 2 other things. So super insulated home, and don't forget about, as you suggest, heat pumps, in my view, ground source heat pump and potentially geothermal energy.
There's no
I think that the, sorry, ground
We can't hear what he's saying.
The suggestion here is super insulate homes, so that is part of looking at zero carbon buildings, so that it's about NDB policies. So the reason I haven't mentioned the deep geothermal is because that isn't available everywhere, and I haven't had the time to go through and see which areas you can maybe drill down deep enough. And it's nothing stopping anybody saying, yeah, we want deep geothermal. And the heat pumps can be either air source or ground source or water source. I'm not saying which in this thinking, it's just heat pumps, a really good source of local energy.
Very exciting times in there. Question right at the back and the side there.
Could I just ask why you merely sort of gave a nod to to water energy in a county which has got more ups and downs?
Many years ago, I ran the Cornwall Energy Project, which did the first proper resource look at renewables in Cornwall. We had a hydro guy do it, and he found 800 odd hydro sites in Cornwall. It amounted to 20 megawatts, which is very, very small. So I've mentioned it in passing, but I'm trying to look at the big picture stuff here, rather than the detail. It's not saying it's not worth doing, because it is.
Yes.
Yes, just a quick remark. I hear what you say about air source and ground source heat pumps. Now recently I considered backfitting an air source heat pump in my home, and I called in a company to take a look at it and give me a quote. It was very, very expensive, prohibitively so. Now, do you see a time in the future where, for this reason or for that reason, the prices might become more within reach of ordinary people? Or is it only for the rich?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that one. I hope it will.
But if you haven't got an answer, you can't really promote it.
Yes, I can.
You can't afford it.
Lots of these technologies are upfront cost, but you're renting oil and you're renting gas.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you start to look at independent energy from within your own home, zero low carbon, as we talked about, geothermal, ground source, all of those things a lot less over time. Your energy bills will drop off. You won't hear from the from EDF and all these people. You'll forget they ever existed. You have to spend the money up front, and I agree, it's a very very costly thing.
Yes.
Talking about the cost as well, because if you haven't got the money, you haven't got the money. But the electric vehicles have been mentioned, and we would love to have an electric vehicle, but again, we don't have much money. And they need to become more, these things need to become more available for sort of people who don't have a lot of money. Otherwise,
one of the things I'm thinking about working on is financing for electric vehicles. And half the cars on the road, they say, are leased. So I don't see any reason why we shouldn't have leasing for electric vehicles, making them 200 a month or whatever it is.
it's the way of doing electric vehicles is leasing.
Yeah. I think no electric vehicle should be sold without its own solar panel or windmill myself, but it might take a while to get to that.
There is an issue here definitely about access to finance.
Yeah.
And Charmian and I have had lots of conversations over the years about the banking structure and who gets access to the money and who doesn't. And what we do not want to do is basically end up giving to those who have already,
Yes.
to the detriment of those who don't. So I think this is about a collective effort to try and figure out how we change that and see what models there are.
Town
Absolutely.
and parish councils could look at, as part of their climate emergency declarations, of having car shares at their electric cars.
Did everybody hear what Sue said?
No.
Can you
No.
repeat it, Charmian?
Can you repeat what Sue said, Charmian?
Sue suggested that town and parish councils, as part of the NDP process, should be looking at encouraging car sharing,
With electric cars.
and particularly with electric cars. That means install electric vehicle points.
Thank you. Yes, question from.
Yeah, Joanna Kenny from Newquay. I know all about the neighbourhood planning. I think the overall projects are fantastic, exactly what we want to do. It's what you can do in the neighbourhood plan. You can't in a neighbourhood plan say everybody's got to have an electric car. I don't think you can even say every new house should have an electric charging point in it. I would love to have a policy like that. I don't think you can do it. And
You
when
can,
you
there's
say
nothing
don't
stopping
say
it.
no for an answer.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, the process is, I totally agree with you, you need to get the planning inspector trained. It will take you 15 years.
No,
In the
I'm
meantime,
telling you that
I'm
one.
sorry, no, it will.
It will.
In the meantime, we are trying to get neighbourhood plans through. They are completely dependent on the independent inspector. I can give you an example. We tried to get sort of fast, the present things in, and we were told, you cannot do it, the law doesn't allow you to do it. And that's what the inspectors are saying. So I think the projects are fantastic. I think translating them into policies and the neighbourhood plan are quite extraordinarily difficult.
If it wasn't difficult, we wouldn't be trying to do it, would we? To quote Kennedy, whoever it was. No, I don't accept reality like that. I accept the reality that we're going to work really hard and we're going to succeed. Because if we don't, our children are dead. And
But I think it's important to notice that there are some really massive structural problems that are stopping
Yeah.
us doing the right thing.
Yeah.
So where we need to focus is how we
change.
channel the energy that we've got, because I'm not going to give up either, and I know how hard it is. I've come up against a planning system, and it is a head wrecker. So how do we change it? That is the question. Yes, it's really hard, but it's required. We need to do it. So how do we do that? With the experience of people like you, who know where the blockages are, and the determination of somebody like Charmian with her energy expertise. So yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Ellie, I'm actually representing a permaculture sustainability project in Cornwall and Extinction Rebellion, and I just feel that at the heart of all these policies there seems to be missing the idea that to be truly sustainable we're looking 7 generations into the future, and I can't help but wonder, with all this high technology and all this massive infrastructure that we need to go in, are we actually really thinking 7 generations ahead? I just question it. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good point.
So I think maybe 3 more questions, one from each side. So Reba, this side there.
So obviously, like us as a whole, like we're going to make some kind of change. But do you know of any? So we don't have the power. Like we have the power of numbers, but we don't have the power of the money, as we're all saying. Do you know of any kind of policy implementation where developers are going to have to say, if there's a new build, they'll have to supply 50% solar power.
Yeah.
Why don't we implement change like that on a wider basis from the beginning?
That's the kind of thing we want to see in the policies coming forward, and it's what Dan's going to be talking about after lunch.
Awesome.
Charmian, I think whilst we're talking about energy and the neighbourhood planning process, probably.
Can you speak up?
Yeah, sorry. Whilst we talk about energy in the neighbourhood planning process and how our electricity fee is a big chunk of our demand, it's worth passing comment about how inefficient the grid is and make that the backstop. That if we consider that our energy has to be produced elsewhere outside of our neighbourhood, how inefficient that is, how much carbon footprint that has. And if there's a presumption that we have to deal with it locally, that we lose that inefficiency.
Did you hear that?
Mark is making the point that because we're buying our electricity from up country, it's coming from a very long way away, and A, if it's fossil or biomass made, then it's very inefficient in the production of electricity, and B, the transmission and distribution system has lots of losses along the way. So if we generate electricity locally,
How much loss?
it's 18% or so when we get to Cornwall, I think, from memory. 65%.
65%.
If you're talking about fossil fuels.
In 2012, it was 65%.
Not of what hits the wires outside the power station.
That's what's
In terms of your point of use, your flow.
Yeah.
So 65% from the
So
power station.
there's major losses from the power station to our local sockets. So make it locally, and it's a lot more efficient, and you need a lot fewer installations.
That basically, like I said, 65% loss in power from the power station to our plugs if we're moving energy a long way. It's massively inefficient. That's what we mean by inefficient. You create energy to make energy, but you lose so much if you're moving it over a long distance.
Thank you. I was going to say one more question from the far side. So,
Local energy assessor. Two things really. If I can answer a question on the RHI, it's a 7-year funding for air source heat pumps or ground source or water source. The intent of the funding is to provide the difference between a orthodox system like oil and the additional cost of an air source system. You get paid annually on the number of kilowatt demand that your property has, and the most efficient place in the village of St Agnes is the vicarage. Got a ground source heat pump. It pulls 35,000 kilowatt heat demand per year. The person invested 37,000 in the system with a borehole, dual borehole in the front of the vicarage, and he will recoup more than that over 7 years. So renewable heat incentives, you look at the UGen website, that's that. The second thing I'd like to say to the organisers is it's ironic that we have an issue, we believe in the environment, in as much as that, out there you've got many people who can hear but aren't listening, and in here we've got so many people who are listening but can't hear. My question, or statement, I think, is that one of the biggest issues, and I know Amanda Brookman is one of the true Amazonian warriors, the problem that we've got is we've got a very, very divided country and a very, very divided county. In as much as that sometimes if you listen to Radio Cornwall, you've got the courage between 12 and 3, you live in a parallel universe. But I think that, one of your jobs, Charmian, is to prove to us that it's worth so many of us fighting for our children, because I see so much wrong at our leaders within the county that you kind of wonder why, for example, why in St Agnes we've got an entire new building development which is fuelled by LPG. Wonder why we in St Agnes have still got double-decker buses pumping through the village, why I've not yet seen an electric bus promoting Cornwall Council and its beliefs, why we've got a CO2 burden corridor, probably the heaviest in Cornwall, going from Chiverton Cross to Truro College, where the councillors believed it would be a great idea to build and spend £3 million of my money on a football pitch. So I'd like to know why we've got to blight it, because when we go into the dump at St Day, we have to pay for a bag of cement, which doesn't encourage us really to bring our rubbish to the dump. I'd like to know why the wave hub at Hale hasn't had a bit of activity around to see however expensive it is, why we can't get a little power in from the sea, because it's Cornwall. Even if it is a false dream, like Eagle was, it did true, but if it can be dreamed...
Okay, stop.
What I'm saying is,
Yes.
because it proves to us that if you can dream it, you can do it. Yeah? But,
Okay. Thank you.
Because you're dead right, anyways. A couple of quick points. Wave Hub was a decision made some time ago, and it was actually ahead of its time. It is a really hard technical problem to turn wave energy into electricity in a reliable way, and it hasn't really been solved yet. So don't blame the present owners for the decisions that were made quite some time ago, when people thought the wave energy technology was developing faster than it has done. If you want to blame anyone for that, blame the government back in 30 years ago or 40 years ago, when somebody changed the numbers on a wave energy report to 10 times the cost of maintenance of undersea cables and 5 times the cost of concrete to make wave energy look uneconomic. And the people were employed within UKAEA who did that. So that destroyed the wave energy research programme at the time, and I remember that because I was there. I watched it happen. So that's wave energy. The other ones, I wouldn't blame the council for the present situation. They've only just declared a climate emergency. They're only just getting their heads around what that really means. They have had some good stuff done with environmental growth strategy, which said, I wrote a paper on it December 17, so I remember it was a while ago now. But that says they will do the nature bit in relation to planetary boundaries, which Amanda's already talked about. Do you remember her donut picture, or diagram? And Paris 1.5 degrees C. Now, I personally don't think the council realised what that meant, but they have adopted it, so we can use that as leverage to help the movement in the direction that we really need to go. And as for proof, I think just have a look at Stefan's talk.
Charmian,
Well, what
can
do
I
you
just
do?
ask one question?
Yeah,
How many people are in this room from Cornwall County Council and how many are planning on?
I don't know.
Have we got,
Several.
have we got anybody here from Cornwall?
It's an invitation to identify yourself.
As you say, can you call it Cornwall Council?
Cornwall Council, officers and members.
Oh, we have got some.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good.
Great.
That's good.
Yeah,
Are you listening?
So I think, sorry, it's great to see so many questions coming up. We'll pause things now. Hopefully many of the questions will be answered by Dan's talk, which will start at 2 o'clock.